What's the most chilling thing your young child has ever said that made you realize they knew something they shouldn't? My daughter Sophie was 4 when she said something that made my blood run cold. We were having breakfast on a Tuesday morning in our suburban kitchen. I was rushing around frantically, packing her lunch for preschool, checking the weather on my phone, when she looked up from her cereal bowl with those big blue eyes and said, "Mommy, why does Daddy hurt the ladies in the basement?" I nearly dropped the juice box I was holding. The words hit me like a physical blow, reverberating through my skull like a gunshot. "What did you say, sweetheart?" She repeated it, word for word, like it was the most normal question in the world. Her little voice was so matter-of-fact, so innocent, the way other kids might ask why the sky is blue or where babies come from. My husband Mark had left for his business trip the night before, driving off in his pristine sedan with his leather briefcase and pharmaceutical samples. He traveled constantly for work, pharmaceutical sales, he claimed, always gone 3 or 4 days at a time, visiting hospitals and medical conferences across the tri-state area. The basement was his workshop, strictly off-limits to both Sophie and me. He'd installed a heavy industrial lock 2 years ago, the kind you'd see on a storage unit, claiming he was storing expensive equipment and didn't want burglars getting access to thousands of dollars worth of medical supplies. "Sophie, honey, Daddy doesn't hurt anyone. Where did you hear that?" She tilted her head, genuinely confused by my panicked reaction. Her blonde curls bounced as she moved, catching the morning sunlight streaming through our kitchen window. She was wearing her favorite purple dress with tiny unicorns on it. "I heard them crying last night. The lady with the yellow hair was really scared. She kept saying please over and over, like when I beg you for extra cookies." My hands started shaking uncontrollably. The coffee mug I was holding rattled against the counter. Mark had been in the basement until nearly midnight, claiming he was organizing inventory for his next sales trip to Chicago. I'd heard music playing through the floor, classical music, which struck me as completely odd since Mark hated anything that wasn't classic rock. He always said classical music was pretentious garbage for people who thought they were better than everyone else. I'd assumed he was using it to drown out the sound of power tools, or maybe listening to something educational. "What lady, baby? There's no lady in our basement." Sophie stirred her Cheerios thoughtfully, the spoon making tiny clinking sounds against the ceramic bowl. She was always so careful with her breakfast, never spilling a single drop on her placemat. "The one who looks exactly like the missing lady on TV. She keeps asking for her mommy and crying really loud." The missing lady on TV. My stomach dropped to the floor like a stone. For 3 weeks, every local news broadcast had been covering the disappearance of Jennifer Walsh, a 23-year-old nursing student with long blonde hair who looked remarkably young for her age. She'd vanished from Mercy General's parking lot after finishing her night shift. Her car was found unlocked with her purse still inside, keys in the ignition. The entire community was on edge. Parents were walking their college-aged daughters to their cars. The university had tripled security patrols. "Sophie, you were asleep last night. You must have had a bad dream or maybe saw something scary on TV." She shook her head firmly, her expression deadly serious in that way only children can manage when they know adults aren't believing them. "I wasn't sleeping, Mommy. I was really thirsty, so I went downstairs for water from the kitchen. That's when I heard them making noise." "Them?" Her voice dropped to a whisper and she glanced nervously toward the basement door as if afraid someone might hear us talking. "The crying ladies. There's more than one now. Daddy has lots of them down there and they're all really sad." I couldn't breathe. The kitchen felt like it was spinning around me in slow motion. This had to be a coincidence. A child's overactive imagination fed by too much news coverage. But Sophie had never been one to make up elaborate stories or lie about anything. She was practical, literal, observant, just like her father. She noticed details other kids missed and remembered conversations word for word. That's when she said the thing that changed everything forever. Daddy saw me listening at the door. He got really mad and grabbed my arm tight. He told me if I ever tell anyone about the ladies, something really bad will happen to you. The juice box fell from my numb fingers, apple juice splashing across the linoleum floor in a sticky puddle. Sophie looked at the mess with genuine concern. "Are you okay, Mommy? You look really white." I somehow managed to clean up the spill and get Sophie ready for school, my mind reeling the entire time. I helped her into her tiny pink backpack, made sure she had her lunch money, and kissed her goodbye like it was any other normal Tuesday. But nothing would ever be normal again. I dropped her off at Little Scholars Preschool in a complete daze, barely managing to respond to Mrs. Patterson's cheerful good morning greeting. I signed her in mechanically, watching other parents chatting about weekend plans and birthday parties. Their lives seemed so simple, so innocent. Back home, I stood outside the basement door for the first time in months. Mark had made it crystal clear that his workspace was private territory. "I need one place in this house that's just mine," he'd said when I'd asked about helping him organize down there. "You have the entire upstairs, the kitchen, the living room. Can't I have just one space?" The heavy padlock gleamed silver against the dark wood. I tried to remember exactly when he'd installed it. It was right after our neighbor Mrs. Henderson's house was broken into last spring. 3 houses on our street had been hit within a month. "Just being cautious," he'd explained. "Can't be too careful these days. Crime is getting worse everywhere." I pressed my ear against the door, holding my breath. Silence. But then I heard it. A faint scratching sound, like fingernails against wood. And was that whimpering? A soft, desperate sound that made my skin crawl. My heart hammered so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. I backed away from the door, nearly tripping over the laundry basket I'd left at the bottom of the stairs. This was insane. I was letting a 4-year-old's imagination destroy my marriage, my sanity, my entire understanding of reality. Mark was a pharmaceutical sales rep. He had awards hanging in his office upstairs. Salesman of the Year 3 times running. He gave presentations about new medications to doctors and nurses. He'd brought home photos from medical conferences, showing him shaking hands with hospital administrators and pharmaceutical executives, doctors and nurses, like Jennifer Walsh. I spent the day cleaning obsessively, trying to distract myself from the growing dread in my chest. Every creak of the house made me jump. When the washing machine shifted during its spin cycle, I nearly screamed. I scrubbed the kitchen counters until my hands were raw and bleeding, reorganized the pantry twice, and vacuumed the living room carpet so many times I could see the tracks in the fibers. But I couldn't stop thinking about Sophie's words, the absolute certainty in her voice, the way she'd glanced toward the basement door with fear in her eyes. When Mark called at lunch to check in, as he always did during his trips, his voice sounded different, more strained. "How's everything at home?" he asked. "Fine. Sophie's at school. I'm just cleaning." Good, good. Nothing unusual happening? I almost told him about Sophie's comment, almost asked him directly if there was something I should know, but something in his tone stopped me. "No, nothing unusual. When will you be home?" "Thursday evening, like always. I love you. I love you too." But as I hung up, I realized I wasn't sure if that was true anymore. I started thinking about our relationship differently, how Mark always knew where I was, who I talked to, what I spent money on, how he'd gradually convinced me to quit my job, stop seeing friends, rely on him completely, how he monitored our phone bills, internet usage, even my social media accounts. He'd made it seem caring, protective. Now it felt sinister. I remembered how he'd reacted when I'd suggested getting a job when Sophie started preschool. "We don't need the money," he'd said. "Sophie needs her mother available. What if there's an emergency at school?" When I'd mentioned missing my work friends, he'd pointed out how much more time we had together now. When I'd wanted to visit my sister more often, he'd reminded me how expensive gas was getting. He'd systematically isolated me from everyone and everything that might give me independence or outside perspective. When I picked up Sophie from school, I studied her face for any sign that she'd been coached or was making things up. But she chattered happily about finger painting and story time, completely normal except for the way she avoided looking toward the basement door when we came inside. "Tell me more about what you heard last night," I said as we sat at the kitchen table with her afternoon snack of apple slices and goldfish crackers. She took a careful bite of her apple, thinking hard. "The yellow hair lady was saying please a lot, and I want to go home. She sounded like how I sound when I have a bad dream and want you to come cuddle me." "What else did you hear?" "There was banging sounds, like someone hitting the walls, and chains making noise." "Chains?" My blood turned to ice. "What kind of chains?" "Like the ones on my swing set, but bigger. And they were moving around a lot." "What else?" "There was a lady with dark hair who wasn't making noise anymore." My hands clenched into fists. "What do you mean she wasn't making noise?" "She was just lying there really still. Like when Grandpa was sleeping at his funeral, but her eyes were open and she looked really sad." I excused myself and ran to the bathroom, where I vomited until my stomach was completely empty. When I came back, Sophie was still eating her snack, humming a little song to herself. That evening, I called my sister Rebecca under the pretense of asking about weekend plans. But really, I needed to hear a normal voice, to ground myself in reality. "You sound weird," she said immediately. "What's wrong?" "Nothing, just tired." "Sarah, we've been sisters for 32 years. Don't lie to me. You sound absolutely terrified." I almost told her everything. The words were right there, ready to spill out like water from a burst dam. But then I imagined trying to explain that my 4-year-old claimed there were kidnapped women in our basement. Rebecca would think I'd had a complete nervous breakdown. She'd probably call Mark herself, worried about my mental state. "I'm fine, really, just dealing with some stress." "What kind of stress?" "Is Mark okay? Is Sophie okay? You're scaring me." "Everyone's fine. I think I might be getting sick. You know how paranoid I get when I'm coming down with something." After I hung up, I realized I hadn't actually been sick in over a year. Mark was very particular about hygiene, vitamins, and preventive care. He monitored everything I ate, everything Sophie ate. He said it was because he understood the importance of health better than most people, having worked in pharmaceuticals for so long. I also realized I hadn't actually worked since Sophie was born 4 years ago. Mark had insisted we didn't need the money, that his salary was more than enough for our comfortable lifestyle. He'd gradually convinced me to quit my job at the marketing firm, saying Sophie needed her mother at home full-time. When had that happened? When had I become so completely dependent on him for everything? My old colleagues had stopped calling after I'd declined their invitations so many times. My college friends had drifted away when I'd stopped responding to their texts about girls' nights and weekend trips. Even my family had started calling less frequently after Mark had expressed concern about how overwhelming large gatherings were for me. That night, I waited until Sophie was asleep, then crept downstairs with a flashlight. The scratching sound was louder now, more desperate and frantic. I could hear muffled sobbing, and what sounded like chains rattling against metal. There was definitely more than one voice down there. At least 3 distinct cries for help. Someone was definitely being held against their will. Multiple someones. I ran back upstairs and called 911, whispering into the phone that I thought someone might be trapped in my basement. The dispatcher asked if I was in immediate danger, and I said I didn't think so, but please hurry. She said officers would be there within 10 minutes and asked me to stay on the line. As I waited, hiding in my bedroom closet with the phone pressed to my ear, I heard Mark's car pulling into the driveway. The engine sound was unmistakable. His sedan had a slight rattle that he'd been meaning to fix for months. He wasn't supposed to be back until Thursday night. I rushed to the bedroom window and watched him get out of his sedan, checking his phone repeatedly. Had he somehow monitored my call? He'd insisted on managing all our technology, including our phone plan and internet service. He said it was easier to have everything under one account, that it saved money and simplified billing. I'd thought he was being practical. Now I wondered what else he was monitoring. Our location, our conversations, our internet searches. The front door opened and his voice drifted up the stairs, artificially casual. Sarah, I'm home early. Got done with meetings ahead of schedule. I could hear something underneath his normal tone. Suspicion, wariness, the voice of a predator who senses danger approaching. I'm upstairs, I called, trying to sound normal while whispering to the 911 dispatcher that my husband had just arrived home unexpectedly. Just getting ready for bed. I heard his footsteps on the stairs, slow and deliberate. Each creak of the old wooden steps seemed to echo through the house like a countdown. When he appeared in our bedroom doorway, his eyes were cold. Not the warm brown I'd fallen in love with 8 years ago, but something predatory and calculating. Where's Sophie? Sleeping. She had a long day at school. Art class and playground time tired her out. He stepped closer, and that's when I noticed his clothes were dirty. His usually pristine dress shirt had dark stains on it, and there was something dark crusted under his fingernails. Something that looked distinctly like dried blood. You look nervous, he said, studying my face like a scientist examining a specimen under a microscope. Just tired. Long day with Sophie. You know how 4-year-olds can be. Sarah. His voice dropped to a whisper that made my skin crawl. Have you been in the basement? My mouth went dry as sand. Of course not. You know I don't go down there. You made that very clear years ago. Good. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. It was the smile he used on difficult customers, all surface charm with nothing genuine behind it. Because if you had, we'd have a very serious problem. The doorbell rang. Mark's face went completely white, then flushed red with rage. Are you expecting someone? Before I could answer, a voice called out from the front porch. Police! We received a call about a possible emergency. Mark grabbed my arm, his fingers digging into my skin hard enough to leave bruises that would last for weeks. I could see the fury building in his eyes like a storm gathering strength. What did you do? Nothing. I didn't. If you've ruined everything, he hissed, his face inches from mine, his breath hot against my cheek. I'll make sure you disappear just like the others, and then I'll take Sophie somewhere you'll never find her. The officers knocked again, more insistently. Mark released my arm and straightened his shirt, transforming back into the charming salesman in seconds. It was terrifying how quickly he could switch personas, like flipping a light switch. Stay here. Don't say a word. If you make a sound, I'll kill them and then I'll kill you. I listened as he went downstairs and opened the door. His voice was smooth, friendly. The same voice that had convinced me to marry him, to trust him with my life and my daughter's safety. Officers, I think there's been a mistake. My wife has been having some mental health issues lately. Postpartum depression that never quite resolved after our daughter was born. She's been hearing things, seeing things that aren't there. Actually, sir, the call was about someone trapped in your basement. A long pause. I could practically hear Mark's mind racing, calculating his next move like a chess player thinking several moves ahead. That's very strange. There's no one in our basement. It's just storage space for my work supplies. I'm a pharmaceutical sales representative. Would you like to take a look? Yes, sir, if you don't mind. I crept to the top of the stairs and watched as Mark led 2 officers toward the basement door. His hands were shaking as he fumbled with the keys, and I could see sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool evening air. Sorry, it's been locked up for months. Company policy about storing controlled substances. I keep expensive pharmaceutical samples down there worth thousands of dollars. Insurance requirements, you understand. The lock clicked open. As soon as the door opened, the smell hit them like a physical wall. Even from upstairs, I could smell it. A sickly sweet odor that made my stomach turn violently. Death, decay, human waste, terror, the smell of suffering. One of the officers immediately radioed for backup and an ambulance, his voice urgent and professional. We need multiple units and EMS at 1247 Maple Street. Possible kidnapping situation. Multiple victims. Send the crime scene unit and the coroner. Sir, I need you to step away from the door and put your hands where I can see them. There must be some mistake. Hands visible. Step back from the door. Now. I have rights. I'm a respected member of this community. I sell life-saving medications to hospitals across 3 states. I have awards, references. Sir, hands where I can see them. Do not make me ask again. The second officer was already calling for crime scene investigators and the medical examiner. I heard him say multiple victims and immediate medical attention needed and possible homicide scene. Mark was handcuffed on our front lawn as more police cars arrived, their red and blue lights painting our suburban street in ominous colors. Neighbors came out to watch, their faces shocked and horrified. I saw Mrs. Henderson from next door covering her mouth in disbelief. The Johnsons from across the street were holding their teenage daughter close, as if suddenly realizing that monsters could live anywhere. The next few hours were a blur of overwhelming activity. More police arrived in a seemingly endless stream. Crime scene investigators with cameras and evidence bags. The medical examiner with her team. FBI agents in dark suits. I watched from the living room window as they carried out 2 black body bags and one woman who was barely alive, strapped to a gurney with IV lines running into her arms. Jennifer Walsh was found chained to a wall in what Mark had converted into a soundproof cell. She was dehydrated, traumatized, and barely conscious, but breathing. She'd been down there for 3 weeks, surviving on minimal water and scraps of food that Mark had thrown down to her when he remembered. The other 2 had been down there much longer, months. They'd died from injuries, infection, and deliberate neglect. Mark had kept detailed journals about each victim, documenting their decline with clinical detachment. Detective Morrison, a kind-faced woman in her 50s with graying hair and gentle eyes, sat with me in my kitchen while they processed the scene. She spoke with the authority of someone who'd seen the worst humanity had to offer, but still retained her compassion. Your husband is being charged with kidnapping, aggravated assault, murder, and federal crimes related to transporting victims across state lines, she said gently. We're going to need to talk to Sophie about what she saw and heard, but we have specially trained officers who work with children. She's just 4 years old. She doesn't understand any of this. I know. Our child psychologist will make sure she's not traumatized further. But her testimony could be crucial for convicting your husband and possibly saving other lives. How many? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. How many what? How many women were down there? How many did he kill? Detective Morrison's expression darkened. We found evidence of at least 7 other victims over the past 3 years. We're still processing the scene, but we think there may be more. Many more. 7 other victims. Women who had families, friends, careers, dreams, futures that were stolen from them. Women who had simply vanished without a trace, leaving behind heartbroken families who never knew what happened to their daughters, sisters, mothers. Your daughter saved Jennifer Walsh's life, the detective continued. The medical examiner says if you hadn't called when you did, she wouldn't have survived another 24 hours. Her body was shutting down. Sophie spent the next week staying with my sister Rebecca and her family while our house was processed as a crime scene. Yellow tape surrounded our property like a contamination barrier. News vans lined our street for days. Reporters knocked on doors constantly, trying to get statements from neighbors about the monster of Maple Street. The local news coverage was relentless. Our wedding photo appeared on every channel, high school yearbook pictures of the victims, timeline graphics showing when each woman had disappeared, expert commentary about serial killers and how they hide in plain sight. When Sophie came home, she seemed remarkably normal, but I started her in therapy immediately with Dr. Chen, a child psychologist who specialized in trauma recovery. Children, Sophie's age often don't understand the full gravity of what they witness, Dr. Chen explained during one of our first sessions. This can actually protect them psychologically. She knew something was wrong, but she doesn't comprehend the true horror of what was happening in your basement. She knew she needed to tell someone, Dr. Chen continued. Children have incredibly strong instincts about danger, even when they can't articulate why something feels wrong. Sophie's natural honesty and trust in you saved multiple lives. The investigation revealed the full scope of Mark's crimes over the next several months. He'd been using his pharmaceutical sales job as the perfect cover for his activities, scouting victims from hospitals across 3 states. He would identify women who worked night shifts, study their routines for weeks or even months, and then abduct them from isolated parking lots. His sales territory gave him the perfect excuse for traveling and being away from home for extended periods without raising suspicion. The FBI found a detailed journal in his car describing each victim, their names, ages, physical descriptions, work schedules, home addresses, family situations, personal habits, fears. He'd kept photographs of them, both before and after their abductions, trophies from each crime. The man I'd shared a bed with for 8 years, who I'd trusted with my child, was a methodical, calculating monster who had been planning this for years. They also found evidence that he'd been planning to expand his operation significantly. He'd purchased property in 2 other states under false names, isolated farmhouses where he could hold more victims without any possibility of detection. He'd been researching soundproofing techniques, security systems, and disposal methods. Your call that night stopped what could have become one of the worst serial killing sprees in American history, Detective Morrison told me months later. He was escalating rapidly and had the resources and knowledge to continue for years without detection. The trial lasted 8 months and dominated local news coverage completely. Mark's defense team tried desperately to claim I had planted the evidence, that I was having an affair and wanted to frame him for crimes I'd committed myself. They painted me as an unstable housewife who was jealous of her husband's success and travel schedule, suffering from severe mental illness and delusions. They brought in psychiatrists who testified about postpartum depression, false memory syndrome, and the possibility that I'd orchestrated everything to gain sympathy and attention. They suggested that Sophie had been coached to lie, that a 4-year-old's testimony couldn't be trusted. But the forensic evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. DNA evidence linked Mark to all the victims. The basement had been specially soundproofed and equipped with restraints, chains, monitoring equipment, and tools designed for torture. Security footage from hospital parking lots showed his car in the vicinity when several women disappeared. Cell phone records placed him at the locations during the estimated times of abduction. Most damning of all were his own journals, written in his distinctive handwriting, documenting every detail of his crimes with clinical precision. During victim impact statements, Jennifer Walsh's mother stood before the court and thanked Sophie by name, her voice breaking with emotion. That little girl found her voice when my daughter couldn't find hers, she said through tears. She spoke for all the women who couldn't speak for themselves. She is the reason my daughter is alive today, and the reason this monster will never hurt anyone else. The families of the other victims also spoke. Parents who had spent years wondering what happened to their daughters, siblings who had never stopped looking, children who had grown up without their mothers. The courtroom was filled with grief, rage, and gratitude that the nightmare was finally over. Mark was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole on multiple counts of murder, kidnapping, and aggravated assault. He showed no remorse during the sentencing, staring straight ahead with dead eyes as if he was completely disconnected from reality. He never looked at me during the entire trial, but I heard from other inmates' families that he'd been asking questions about our new address and making threats about what he'd do when he got out. We moved across the country after the trial concluded. I used the money from selling the house, after extensive cleaning and renovation, to remove all traces of what had happened there, to start completely over in Oregon, as far from that nightmare as possible. The house sold for significantly less than market value. Even after professional crime scene cleanup and complete renovation, buyers were hesitant to purchase a home where such horrors had occurred. Eventually, a property developer bought it, tore it down completely, and built a new house on the foundation, but everyone in the neighborhood still knows what happened there. Sophie is 8 now and has no memory of that night or what she told me. The trauma specialist said children often forget traumatic events as a protective mechanism, especially when they're very young. Her mind protected her from the full horror of what she witnessed. She's in 3rd grade now, loves soccer and art class, and still has that same literal, practical way of seeing the world that saved Jennifer Walsh's life. She notices things other kids miss. When her teacher lost her wedding ring at school, Sophie found it in the playground sand where no one else had thought to look. When our elderly neighbor Mrs. Garcia fell in her garden and couldn't get up, Sophie was the one who spotted her from our kitchen window and alerted me immediately. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't listened to her. If I dismissed her words as imagination or bad dreams, the way so many adults dismiss children's concerns as unimportant. How many more women would have disappeared into that basement? How many more families would have been destroyed? Last month, Detective Morrison called to tell me they'd connected Mark to 6 more missing persons cases from before he moved to our state. A nursing student in Ohio who disappeared 2 years before we met, a hospital administrator in Pennsylvania, a pharmacy technician in West Virginia, a medical records clerk in Kentucky, 2 more women from different states whose cases had gone cold years ago. The investigation is ongoing, and they believe there may be more victims they haven't identified yet. Your daughter may have prevented dozens of other kidnappings and murders, she said. He was escalating rapidly. The time between abductions was getting shorter, and the violence was getting progressively worse. If he hadn't been caught when he was, we could have been looking at one of the worst serial killing cases in recent history. When I told Sophie she was a hero, she just shrugged in that matter-of-fact way she has, the same way she might respond to being told she did well on a spelling test. I just told the truth, Mommy. That's what you're supposed to do when something's wrong. She paused, then added thoughtfully, adults don't always listen to kids when they say important things, but you did. That's what made the difference. That night, I tucked her into bed in our new house, a house with no basement, no locks I don't have keys to, and windows that actually open. Every door in our house can be opened from both sides. I check them obsessively every night before bed, testing each lock and handle multiple times. Good night, my brave girl, I whispered, kissing her forehead and breathing in the sweet scent of her shampoo. Good night, Mommy. I love you. As I turned off the light, she added quietly, I'm glad the crying ladies don't live with us anymore. I hope they're somewhere safe now where no one can hurt them. She rolled over and went to sleep, leaving me standing in her doorway with tears streaming down my face, overwhelmed by gratitude for her courage and honesty. Jennifer Walsh writes to us sometimes. She's back in nursing school now, working toward a degree in victim advocacy and trauma counseling. She says she wants to help other survivors find their voices and heal from their experiences, just like Sophie helped her find the strength to survive. In her last letter, she included a photo of herself at graduation. She's smiling, surrounded by her family, looking healthy and strong. At the bottom, she'd written, "Thank you for listening to the little voice that saved my life. Sophie will always be my hero." The other families have stayed in touch too. We received Christmas cards from Jennifer's parents, birthday cards for Sophie from the Walsh family. They've created a foundation in honor of all the victims, focusing on hospital security improvements and supporting families of missing persons. Sometimes late at night, when Sophie is sleeping peacefully in her bed, I think about all the women who aren't here anymore, all the voices that were silenced before they could be heard, all the families that are still broken, still grieving, still searching for answers. But then I think about Jennifer Walsh, alive and helping other people heal. I think about all the women who didn't disappear because Sophie found the courage to speak up. I think about all the monsters who might be caught because parents are listening more carefully to their children. Sometimes the most important words come from the smallest voices. You just have to be willing to hear them. And when you do, you might just save a life.